So, let's get right into it. Have you ever really thought about where the gods came from? And I don't mean in a theological way. I'm talking about history. What if the great gods of mythology, the ones throwing lightning bolts and ruling the underworld, what if they weren't born from some cosmic void, but were actually human, just flesh and bone like you and me? And what if their incredible life stories just got bigger and grander and more exaggerated over the centuries until they became gods? Well, that's the wild idea we're digging into.
To get a feel for just how radical this idea was, we need to head back to ancient Greece. The poet Callimachus here is absolutely ripping into the people of Crete for a claim that was, frankly, scandalous. They were insisting that on their island they had a tomb for Zeus, the immortal king of all gods, dead and buried. To everyone else in the Greek world, this was total blasphemy. It was just proof that Cretans were, as the saying went, always liars.
But hang on, just for a second, let's play with that idea. What if the Cretans weren't lying? What if Zeus did have a tomb? Because once upon a time, Zeus was a man who could die. I mean, that one question, right there, it flips everything we think we know about mythology on its head.
And this wasn't just some weird, quirky idea from Crete. It was actually the beginning of a whole theory, a way of thinking that tried to pull the mask off the gods themselves. The guy who first really formalized all of this was a Greek scholar named Euhemerus. Now, you got to remember, he was living in the late 4th century BCE. This was a time when questioning the gods could get you into some very serious trouble. But he went for it anyway. He put forward a theory that was, for its time, completely revolutionary, that there was a rational, historical explanation for where gods came from.
He laid out his proof in a book, which is now lost to us, called The Sacred History. In it, Euhemerus tells this incredible story about a journey to a lost utopian island. And there, he says he found a golden column. And inscribed on that column was the real history of the gods. It wasn't about magic or miracles. It was a record of great human rulers, kings and queens and heroes, whose achievements were so immense that after they died, people just started worshiping them.
And that's where we get this term Euhemerism. It's the core idea that gods aren't born divine, they're made divine. They're made by memory and by stories and by the passage of time. They start out as amazing people, and then, generation by generation, they get promoted, you could say, right up into the heavens. And you can see exactly how it could work. It's a process, right? In year 0, a great leader dies. 100 years later, the facts of their life are a little fuzzy, and they've been replaced by these incredible legends about their strength or their wisdom. Fast forward another 400 years, and those legends have become religious doctrine. The actual human being is long gone, and a god is standing in their place.
Okay, but this is where the story gets really, really interesting. This idea that gods were just men, it was so potent that it ended up being used by two totally opposing groups for completely opposite reasons.
Now listen to this. This is basically the battle cry of the early Christians. Clement of Alexandria, a big deal Christian scholar, grabbed onto Euhemerism with both hands. You can just hear the confidence in that quote, can't you? It's not just a debate tactic, it's a mic drop. He's declaring that the old gods have been exposed.
And that's the key. For the early church, Euhemerism was the perfect intellectual weapon. I mean, think about it. How do you convince an entire world to give up Zeus and Apollo and all the rest? You don't just say, our God is better. You argue that their gods aren't even gods to begin with. They were just flawed mortal humans who got a major, undeserved promotion.
The Christian writer Cyprian of Carthage laid it out perfectly back in the 3rd century. He's basically describing the process we just saw on that timeline as simple, obvious history. A king dies, people honor him, they build a temple, they start some rituals, and boom, what started as a memorial service has turned into a full-blown religion. It was a killer way to drain all the magic and power out of the pagan world.
But just look at the incredible irony here. It's wild. On one side, you have Euhemerism being used as a weapon to tear down pagan beliefs, and on the other, it's used as a shield to protect them. The exact same argument that gods were originally just people was used to achieve the complete opposite goals.
So now, let's jump forward about 1,000 years to 13th century Iceland. There's this historian, Snorri Sturluson. Now, he's a Christian, but he absolutely loves the old stories of his ancestors. Odin, Thor, the whole gang. But he's got a huge problem. In Christian Europe, you can't just write about these guys as if they're real gods. That's heresy. So how do you save these incredible myths from being wiped out by the church?
Well, his solution was absolutely brilliant. He used Euhemerism. In his masterpiece, the Prose Edda, Snorri completely reframes the whole thing.
He presents the Norse gods not as deities, but as great human heroes, kings and warriors who migrated north from ancient Troy. So Odin wasn't a god, he was a really smart chieftain. Thor wasn't the god of thunder, he was just an incredibly strong warrior. By turning mythology into history, he made it safe. He could write down all these amazing stories without committing a sin. It was a genius move that basically saved Norse mythology for the rest of us.
So what happens when someone takes Snorri's clever historical framing and treats it not as a literary device, but as a literal treasure map? Well, for that, we have to jump to the 20th century.
Enter Thor Heyerdahl. You probably know him from the famous Kon-Tiki expedition. This was a guy who believed ancient myths contained literal truths. So he reads Snorri's Prose Edda, and he gets this idea in his head. If Odin was a real king, then his kingdom must be a real place. A place you could actually find.
Heyerdahl got fixated on Snorri's mention of the gods coming from a land called Aesir. He started looking at maps, east of the Caucasus Mountains, and he zeroed in on Azerbaijan. He became convinced this was the ancestral homeland of the Norse gods, and that Odin was a real chief who led his people on this epic migration all the way up to Scandinavia.
And he believed he had clues. He pointed to things like similarities between ancient rock carvings in both places. He also pointed out what he thought were linguistic links, like the name Azov being connected to Aesir, the word for the Norse gods. But the academic world was, let's say, not impressed. Mainstream historians and linguists look at this stuff and see coincidences. They argue that Snorri's intro was just a clever story, not a history text.
And that's pretty much where things stand today. While Heyerdahl's search for Odin makes for a fantastic adventure story, it's overwhelmingly rejected by the academic community. They pretty much label it pseudoscience. The evidence is just too thin, it relies on surface-level coincidences, and it ignores these massive gaps in time and culture. It's a fun idea, but it just doesn't hold up to scrutiny.
But look, whether or not a specific god was once a real person, the fact that this idea, Euhemerism, keeps popping up tells us something really profound about ourselves. It points to this deep, fundamental need we have to find the divine within the human.
It always starts with one person, somebody who does something amazing, who pushes the limits of what we all thought was possible.
Then the story begins. Their actions are told and retold, and with each telling, the story gets a little more polished, a little more incredible, until it shines like a legend.
And finally, that legend becomes so big, so important to who we are, that it rises above history itself. The human is gone, and a myth is left in their place.
And that brings us right back to today, doesn't it? The same process Euhemerus wrote about more than 2,000 years ago is still happening all around us. We might not build temples anymore, but we create our own pantheons, don't we? From athletes, from scientists, from the pages of comic books. So I guess the real question is, have we ever really stopped turning our most remarkable people into gods?